welcome to today's Women in the Creative Industries discussion, in which we'll be sharing some thoughts and experiences about what it means to be creative as women, how we navigate our way through the cultural landscape. And I think we'll also be exploring how we can learn from the past and perhaps thinking about how we might like to shape the future. My name's Sandra Hebron and I'm Head of Screen Arts at the UK's National Film and Television School. And my job today is really just to provide some prompts and a few questions to our panelists, who individually and collectively have an absolute wealth of experience to draw on. And before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce each of them briefly. So we're joined today by Gretchen Landau. Gretchen is a Los Angeles-based film and television entertainment producer with a background in media sales and marketing strategy, including for major studios. She now runs her own company, Drop of Water Entertainment. And her recent productions include the documentary Feminists, What Were They Thinking?, currently screening on Netflix, which considers the rise and the legacy of second wave feminism in the US, and which I think in no small part was a prompt for today's conversation. So welcome, Gretchen.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Funmilola Fagbamila, and Funmilola is a Nigerian-American playwright, actress, and professor. Her remarkable stage play on the complexities of Black political identity, The Intersection, has toured internationally and met with widespread critical acclaim and widespread audience enjoyment. She currently serves as Professor of Pan-African Studies at California State University, and she was one of the contributors to Feminists, What Were They Thinking? Hi, Funmilola, thanks for joining us.
So happy to be here.
And then our final panelist today is Bobette Buster. Bobette is a lecturer, a producer, an author, and a passionate advocate for storytelling. She leads storytelling workshops for companies and corporations, including Disney Pixar, Sony, the BBC, and Google. She writes and lectures widely and internationally about storytelling. She's also a filmmaker, having produced the documentary Making Waves, The Art of Cinematic Sound. And she is Professor of the Practice of Digital Storytelling at Northeastern University in Boston. Bobette, hi, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I thought we could start with an idea which I guess is something, or was a mantra, if you like, of second wave feminism, the idea that the personal is political. And I wonder if I could invite each of you to talk a little bit about the point at which you recognized that your creativity would be part of your working life. So Gretchen, maybe you could start for us.
Well, I started my career in radio, and I think I just fell into it, and I fell in love with it, and the ability to really tell a story without visuals was an interesting practice. And that was in high school, I think, just exploring, and I ended up working for a public radio station, a jazz station. So I got to spin really CDs, not records back then, and interview all of the artists who would come into town to play. So that was, I think, the first exciting moment where it was being in the arts and storytelling, and it was more than just music. And I think that was probably the first.
And that sort of involvement in the arts, that always felt accessible to you, or?
I think growing up in Los Angeles and around LA, it's always accessible. And I went to a junior college, and the radio station that happened to be there, and it was one of the best radio stations that was, competing with LA stations. So it just fell into place for me. So yeah, I think just being lucky to be around the entertainment industry.
Thank you. Babette, how about you?
Well, I would say mine was the opposite. I grew up in small town America in Kentucky, and at the end, it was the end of an era in which a little girl could be sent, i.e. me, to the town movie theater by myself, and my grandmother and aunt would hand me a quarter each. That was enough to get into the movie theater and also to buy a snack. And nobody was inquiring what I was watching, but what I was watching was the end run of North by Northwest or an Ingrid Bergman movie. I was seeing the best of the best all by myself, sitting there with my popcorn, watching fantastic movies. And I would walk home longing, filled with longing. How do I leave this small town and ever make it to Hollywood? And so it was just an impulse I had from the time I can remember. And so eventually a long and winding road ended up in Hollywood. I went to USC Graduate School of Cinema. And at that time in the program I got into, the Peter Stark producing program, there were only 3 women. And I would say hardly any better statistics in the production program and film criticism. So both of those, as I look back now, were the end of an era. And so I was in a sort of an entry group of people trying to get into Hollywood, and I discovered that development was the lifeblood of Hollywood storytelling. And I got a job in Hollywood, to my astonishment. So.
Thank you. And Funmilola, coming to you, because I guess you came into this into the sort of creative industries a little bit later. So how was it for you?
Well, I think that I did come into it later in a way. I would say that it wasn't until the last few years that I realized that my work as a creative in many ways started off intertwined with my impulses to advocate for what I thought was necessary. And so when in high school, I went to a predominantly white high school, and one of the first things that I did ever in my life that really challenged me to do something that was like unpopular or not perceived of as cool, would draw attention to me, was extremely frightening, was to go to the authority figures in the school, the principals, and tell them in February that they weren't presenting any Black History Month announcements on the morning announcements. They would announce everything and anything that was going on, socially, but Black History Month was never mentioned. And I'm like one of 10 Black girls in this high school, right? And so essentially it was probably the first moment that I did something where I was exposing myself, because I had to do the research and prep the Black History program at that point as like a 15-year-old student and present it to my student body. And of course, as a kid, you don't know how that's going to be received by your peers. Again, in high school, you're just trying to kind of move through, navigate, and be as cool as possible without, garnering too much potentially negative attention. But I think it was during that time that it was birthed in me to say what I needed to say, even if my voice was going to tremble, right, as that saying goes. And it was like a push through that door energetically, which then led to, it was the impetus behind what would eventually become my career in theater and in storytelling, because I had something to say. I didn't quite yet know exactly how to say it. I was observing these dynamics in the world that I wanted to address, sometimes through poetry, through whatever it may be. But at first, before I could do it through creative means, I would just speak it, right? And I started to develop my oratory skills. I was put in positions in college where I was thrust in front of people to discuss very nuanced, difficult, complex social issues. And I'm just like, this is terrifying, right? But because I learned how to do that, it then transformed into, okay, I'm a poet. I now have become an orator. How do I take what I know that I know how to do and the things that I know that I want to say and present it to an audience in a way that can be moving to their hearts and not just to their minds? Because, the intellect is moved oftentimes by data and stats, but the heart is moved by the story, right? And so I was like, I'm in academia. I see people's minds move all the time, but I'm also an artist. I see what happens when people's hearts are shifting. So then that led to theater. And so it was all just building onto each other year after year. And eventually theater led to, okay, I love the dynamic between humans face to face. When the pandemic hit, of course, it gave me a space to think the possibilities of storytelling outside of face-to-face interaction, and to see what digital storytelling would look like for myself. So I said a lot.
But you said a lot, but I want to ask you a further question, really, which is, you mentioned the idea of being sort of really thrust into things as, you know, a way of learning. Have there been other things that you can identify that either helped you on the sort of journey or that got in the way?
Oh my gosh. I just have, like, throughout my whole like teenage years, through college, through grad school, I was continuously thrust into the most uncomfortable environments, right? So in high school, I'm one of the only Black girls navigating, but also I'm a Nigerian young girl amidst a culture that tells you just to be nice and kind and be a doctor and just get a nice job and get your husband and just feed him food and just be quiet. And I was very much not that, right? And so I knew I was, by the time I got to college and started to put words to the things that I knew was going on in the world energetically, but then I started to be able to articulate them, right? Then I was thrust by some of my mentors in college because they saw something in me in undergrad and they were like, yeah, you go talk about this, right? And before you know it, people started to refer to me as an activist because I was talking about the things that I was seeing in the world. I didn't necessarily view myself as an activist because I'm just like, listen, if something needs to be addressed, if we just all address it, it won't necessarily have to be viewed as advocacy. It'll just be humans being human for the sake of being human, right? That's a whole nother conversation I want to get into about the ways in which we applaud advocacy for the sake of not having the need to take it on for our own selves. That's another conversation. But yeah, I was in undergrad, I was doing a lot of advocacy work. By the time I was in grad school, I was TAing for a professor, or I was sent to, you know, essentially interview with him so he could see whether or not I could work as his TA. And that was also an environment where I started to understand my identity as a woman, because he was a very well-respected historian who saw me waiting for him at the front of his door so that he could come talk to me about TAing his very prestigious history class, a Black history class. And he looked at me and I could just see what his face did. His, you know, internally, it was like, you, they sent you, right? You. And in my brain, I'm already computing what his face is doing there. By the time I get in there, I just let him talk to me as if I was an idiot, right? He was like, oh, well, you know, I'm going to need 3 resources and I need you to send me this. And I need, you know, these people to send you letters of references. And I'm just like, okay. Knowing that he's just trying to see that this young girl who, you know, she couldn't possibly be smart enough, even though I was a grad student too. So in essence, I let him do what he was doing. And then after he was done being ridiculous, I gave my little spiel, right? And I was like, okay, well, first we would start off in 13th century literature, and then we'd break it down into, and he was like, oh, she's smart, right? And I just saw something kind of happen inside of him. And so, I mean, the uncomfortable environments, I could talk about BLM, and I don't want to go on for too long, but BLM, the movement and the organization, the inception of the movement in 2013, how uncomfortable it was to be at the forefront and at the helm of something that was not yet popular conversation. Now it's a popular conversation. 7 years ago, we were all still perceived of as radicals, as extreme, as unrealistic, as idealistic, as all of these things, right? And so it's been a profound gift to be placed in uncomfortable environments time and time again and have to just figure it out.
Thank you. I mean, that's such a kind of vivid, you know, we have a very vivid sense, I think, of what that some of the things around that, sort of discomfort, as you say. Gretchen, Bobette, it's sort of a similar question, really. What kinds of things do you feel have helped you in terms of developing your own creative work? And conversely, what gets in the way of that?
Well, just quickly, I'm talking about uncomfortable. Again, back in my radio days, I started the first Spanish talk radio network. And I started that, I was working in an elementary school in San Clemente. And I worked with the kids. Most of the kids, I'm in San Clemente, 60 miles from Mexico, from the border. So a lot of the children were their families, and they were from Mexico. And I was practicing Spanish. And this little boy that I knew very well, he looked at me and he said, "Stop speaking Spanish to me. Don't speak Spanish." I'm like, "Miguel, tell me why. What's going on?" He's like, "I hate anything that has to do with Mexico." And I thought, that message, this is a 6-year-old boy who's getting this message. He's Mexican and he hates everything that has to do with Mexico. So that's where the light bulb came on for me. It's like, and coming from radio, I'm like, radio is a perfect medium to reach the Latinx community. So I ended up, things fell into place and started this network, and it was some of the best radio I was ever a part of, but I didn't speak Spanish, not well. So I was in meetings that started in English and immediately shifted into Spanish. And it was a lot of just fast learning and well worth the challenge. But I think that has translated into my film work as well. It's, you want to, as Funmilola was saying, it has to come from the heart. You can't just be intellectual about it. And that's from my radio training, that I think has been really beneficial. If you can't interview someone and really get to the heart of the subject, you're not going to interest people. So I think that has been a really good foundation for my film work.
Thank you. And Bobette, I wonder how that sort of chimes with you, particularly with some of your work around storytelling.
Well, I would say that my introduction to my dreams, trying to make them into a career, there were constant obstacles, constant. There was glass ceilings, glass walls, there was sexual harassment. There was a lot of, who do you think you are? Why should anyone let you in the room? And what I noticed, for example, at USC, which was arguably the #1 film school in the world, that Hollywood was circling like vultures for the next young white male director, because that was the environment where we were in. Young white male directors would create the next, great franchise and what was driving the market were young men all over the world. And so guys were constantly being given opportunities. And you would hear people say, and I was working for a major Hollywood director, and I would hear the major agency he was with, they would always say, "We'll surround this young person with experience, the young man." But if a young woman came in who had just come from graduate school, maybe she won an Emmy, student Emmy, maybe she won a student Oscar, they'd say, "She's not quite ready yet." And then as I watched, as there were hardly any women executives. Over the years, women executives started filling the ranks to the point of 50-50. And so, and everyone thought, okay, the gatekeepers are there. They're going to bring in women. And what I found was they were not playing on the same level playing field as the guys. The guys kept going, he's one of us. Let's bring in the next talent. Let's surround them. Let's support them. The women executives would say they didn't want to appear to be preferential. They wanted the best person for the job. And they felt, and they constantly would say, "I think this woman director needs more experience." A guy could have a mediocre film or a flop and he'd get another chance. Woman, her career was over. So when I would at times be in a position to challenge the women executives and say, why not surround this woman director or writer with experience, they would say, well, that's not for me to do. That's for them to find their way. So it was a blind spot. It was a constant struggle of trying to raise consciousness about how do we build a community of opportunity. And there's much I could say about that. I just want to say one story is that the DGA in 2010 had this big, huge event to celebrate, in their words, the fact that in 1975, a group of women who had Student Academy Awards, Student Emmys, who'd had real accomplishment, they gathered together and secretly, by hand, because there was no digitization, pulled out all the data to show that women were only at 4% as directors, DPs women were at 3%, women writers were at 11%. It was 1975. 35 years later, and diversity, forget it. You know, maybe television had 14%. I remember these figures vividly. And 35 years later, those figures had not budged. And so the DGA was wanting to celebrate the fact that these women had raised consciousness, had gone to the studios. The DGA had sued the studios for a while. And the studios came out and said, who are you to tell us who we can hire? And the women who were sort of being feted as heroes literally said, we should be sitting Shiva. This is nothing to celebrate. So the figures have budged a little bit. Certain festivals and certain international markets have said we're only accepting 50-50 women now, so the figures are budging. But it's been, you know, in a capitalistic system, which is Hollywood, it's been very difficult to push this into parity.
Yeah, and I think that's a question that we'll want to come back to as we go through our conversation about how do we not keep kind of taking one step forward and then sort of one step back, because sometimes it feels like, I mean, certainly I often feel that I'm having conversations that are not dissimilar to conversations that I was having in 1986, and I don't really want to keep on having those same conversations. So I think, you know, for sure, I think let's come back to that. One thing that I'm interested in as we talk about each of your sort of respective areas of work is just to ask you to say a little bit about the kinds of stories that you're interested in telling, and also, I mean, what stories do we want to tell? But also, I think it relates to what do we want to hear, what do we want to listen to, and whether you feel that there's opportunity to tell the kinds of stories that you want to. Gretchen, maybe you could start.
Well, going back to feminists, what were they thinking? I had met Johanna Dimitrakis, the director, and the editor, Kate Amend. I had worked with Kate before. And just hearing about this film and what Johanna, what she envisioned, I just wanted to be a part of it. And I think the women in the film, it was interesting. I mean, growing up in the 60s and 70s and being a kid, not really fully being present, to hear their stories, to hear Jane Fonda say, you know, she was constantly told, and women were constantly told to be a good girl.
Yeah.
Meant that we weren't good. And that, when I heard that, it was like, oh my, I've gotten that messaging my entire life. And I think we need to address that, the language that women, you know, live with and have embraced as well. We need to break that down and really, I think, address it and move on from it. So I think feminists, that film kind of woke me up to that. And I think the women then talking, you know, about their experience in their 70s and 80s. I mean, Johanna, the director, she was 80 when the film finally, you know, came into the world. Well, two things. That was, I think they were dealing with that, you know, just kind of breaking those things down and trying to break that pattern in themselves. So when the second wave came in, I think they were like, let's all join in the fight. And I think they missed the fact that the women of color, they couldn't, and this is something Funmilola can speak to, I think, better than I can. It was, they didn't have a consciousness of what other women's experience was. I think white women certainly had a lot of privilege in the 70s and in that second wave. So I thought that was definitely an interesting point. But then also that looking at these women in their 80s talking, they all had careers past 45, which I think in the 70s, that wasn't possible to even think that. So there were a lot of things going on with that film. And those stories to me are still, are relevant and so important today. So that I look for stories that really tell the whole story and complex characters. And we all have different experiences that we share a lot of the same things, but we're not there yet. We need to be telling all of these other important stories.
And it feels like there's there's sort of two things that I'm noticing in what everyone is saying. This idea of being good, somehow we have to be good. And then also, of course, the ongoing questions around privilege and our own privilege and how we sort of deal with that and kind of recognize. But Funmilola, I wonder for you in terms of that sense of the kinds of stories that you want to tell, and whether you feel that there's opportunity to do that.
As I listen to Gretchen explain also, her interest in what she wants to create and talking about complexity, and I observe all of these feelings rise inside of me when I talk about these things, and I almost have to just and I know that this is a space where I can be myself and say that out loud, right? But I literally have to bring it and just come back to an equilibrium, because it is so deeply important to me to address so many of the things that are of such urgency right now that I don't think that humans quite understand. And what I mean by that is that when people think, what do people think about when I say a word like urgent? Okay, people dying, what's happening in political infrastructures that are crumbling, where people don't have access to what they need, climate change. That's not even actually really what I'm addressing in that conversation around urgency. As urgent as that is, I think what is even of greater urgency that would allow for us to deal with some of the most pressing issues is humans being able to do nuance and complexity better. And it's like, okay, well, what does nuance and complexity and storytelling have to do with all of these things? Part of the reason that humanity struggles so deeply is because we refuse to see the humanity in each other. Because if you are too different from me, I can't quite hear you. On an emotional level, I cannot quite hear you. Instead of just taking a moment to really hear what that person has to say. What do I mean by that? What type of stories do I want to tell? Stories about nuance and complexity. In the Black community, and what I mean by this is diasporic Black community in Black America, in Nigeria, in African nations, but specifically, again, in Black communities, the conversation always must be more nuanced than what it is generally, right? So if I'm talking about gender, there's no way I can even address my gendered experience as somebody that identifies as woman, right? That, like, for instance, in this moment, I want to talk about why people are so astonished by the fact that, for instance, young women in the entertainment industry are now capturing and taking hold and autonomy of their sexuality in a way that makes it so that they perform, for instance, in an industry that's very visible, music, perform, and they're performing in ways that feel very outwardly and openly and visibly sexual. And then there's a whole contingent of people that are just they're exploiting their bodies. This is not good. They think this is liberation. It is not liberation. And then there's a whole contingent of people that are like, no, the reason that you think that that's exploitative is because you've been conditioned into believing that a woman's sexuality should not be her own, that it should be only for the consumption of males under a capitalist structure. That's the only purpose it serves. And I watch how both parties argue with each other, when the truth of the matter is that it's a little bit more nuanced than what either one of them is saying. there may be some exploitation happening there, because if you are presenting your sexuality in a way that can be consumed under the narratives that currently exist that are still, you all understand where I'm going with this, right? I'm not trying to get into a lecture, but but basically, what I say all of this to say that, like, in Black communities, if they see young Black women enjoying their bodies and living their lives, there's a post-traumatic stress that's tapped back into the way that Black women were hypersexualized, and then for the sake of survival had to pretend as if they had no sexuality and not call too much attention to themselves as an outgrowth of the trauma of racism and chattel slavery. And then, but then on the opposite end of that is an other dehumanization, which is that you don't get to be a full human with sexual expression at all because you don't want to call too much attention to the community, making you look unrespectable. But people with opinions on either side of the how you can say room, they tend to not be able to understand that the truth is somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the nuance, somewhere in the gray area. They just think that they're right and the other people are stupid. But that is because we are more increasingly living in a world of absolutes that is driven by social media, I believe. The title of the article, however many characters it is, we read the title, we don't read the fine print, might not even click on the article, but just get that snappy, quick information as our attention spans continue to get shorter and shorter, and then we wonder why nuance gets lost upon us. It takes patience to say, oh, I understand what they meant by that, but maybe it's a little bit, you see. So that's what I want to talk about. That's what I am talking about in my in my work.
Well, I think it's also the responsibility of the producer. And as a producer, it's like, I want to build a team that's diverse and that's going to bring their point of view to the table. I mean, that's so exciting to me. I'm frankly bored with white people telling stories that don't belong to them. I don't want to hear that. They're, just creating something that's not real. So I want to always have a very diverse, and I usually have mostly an all-female crew, because not all, I mean, there are a few men, but I want to work with and give the opportunity to women and have a diverse team.
And in your work as a producer, do you find that sort of there's an appetite, if you like, for the kind of stories that you want to work on and that you want to tell, to bring, a kind of greater range? Gretchen, how receptive do you find it when you're going out to people and trying to raise money for projects?
That's always the hard part, raising money for projects. But I am finding that people are more interested in seeing stories about women told by women. Raising money, that's a whole different ballgame. I could let Bobette speak to that. I know we're working on a project together and talking about that now. I am unconventional. I do things probably backwards, and I make things harder on myself. I've done a lot of crowdfunding for my projects to start, and talk outside of the studio world, because I find just networking with people I've met and know, and I'm introduced to different people and find money in different areas. But again, I think that also brings some diversity to a project.
Thanks. Babette, please, maybe you can pick up on that if
Well, I find in my career that telling stories by women about women has been an uphill battle. If you were telling a certain kind of story that had, from my point of view, a masculine titillation factor, like it's a woman really exploring her sexuality, or a woman who becomes, a crazed robber, or a woman who goes to the dark side. To me, those were appealing to the masculine idea of what women could do. It was a fantasy idea. But I've had some major projects with one with a number one top female star and a female director who had won awards, and took it out through Hollywood, the studio system, and it was based on a true story. And it involved a woman who was a drug smuggler who became overwhelmed with poor children on the streets in Colombia. And she took them in, and it was a redemption story of how she decided to become a mother to these street children. And so we had everything. We had the whole package together. It was going to happen. And the number of male executives who said, oh, this woman, she should die in the end. How dare she have a redemption? So this bias against telling truthful stories, I found time and time again up against a male idea of, again, what is the good girl? What is their version of entertainment? And that's just one of many stories. So I think what I also see as a problem for female stories over and over again is people will say they're soft. You know, oh, that's a little soft, or what's the audience for that, or does it cross over? That sort of questioning all the time. And they wouldn't be asking that of a male story if it was soft. So again, I feel like I'm coming in at the end of an era that is now embracing new kinds of storytelling, and that's hopeful. But I then also have to say, are the new kinds of storytelling, are they aware? Are they really working towards a new voice that is telling authentic stories? Or are they still trying to fit a model that satisfies this so-called crossover male audience? And right now, I think, given the fact that we're in a new business model with streaming and broadcast, there are many more opportunities, many more possibilities for authentic storytelling. And frankly, so much money has been left on the table by people not responding to who has the money and the will to watch great stories? Women. And so I feel like it's a matter of gatekeepers, and it's a matter of women believing in their own stories and pushing it through and finding alliances.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just jump in off of that, I think that you ask a really great question, Bobette, around are we really moving toward telling more authentic stories? And the thing is, I think that there are so many people there that desire to move in that direction, but will we? Becomes a question of, well, yeah, is there the audience there, and all of these questions around like whether or not it will actually be well received. And I feel that there's always this lingering conversation about not wanting to push the needle too far, to the point where you don't actually get access to what you need and you're not able to move forward with your career because your work was too much outside of what we are used to consuming. You could just push it just a little bit further, right? So now we have a story about a woman, and maybe it's not centering a conversation around love or some man that she's affiliated with, just a complex story about her. But I think that when opportunities potentially could come for us to really push the needle forward and have more honest, authentic, nuanced characters, creatives that have that work, sometimes their work is not fully received because of the fear that it won't translate, that it won't sell, even if the people that it's being pitched to know that, like, this is good, this is important. I can't tell you all how many times I've had those conversations where they're just like, this is brilliant, but they're just trying to figure out the mechanics of the, like, how are we going to sell it? How are we going to present it? And I get it. It's important. I'm new to this, and I know how important that is. But at the same time, I'm like, people don't want to sacrifice their own careers in a lot of ways to be the person to push that forward. And so sometimes we compromise and we just try to get one little foot in the door when really what we desire to do is to smash it down, right? With these stories. And so I'm just speaking from a person who's experiencing it currently.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say that Chloe Zhao and Frances McDormand's Nomadland was a total innovation, and it won the Academy Award, deservedly so. A woman's point of view of what is it to lose in the capitalism, you know. And Frances McDormand's husband died, and she lost her home, and it's a reinvention of the Western. And she goes on the road and she discovers the power of tending and befriending. That is a quintessential female trait. The only time she gets angry is when she overhears, like, I think it's her niece or nephew, talking about buying a big house for $600,000. And she's saying, no, don't do that. No. And the whole point is how do you discover your authentic self in this post, middle class world, because the middle class is gone. Now, I thought that was a profound piece of work. And it got made because Frances McDormand, at that time, 2-time Academy Award winner, had the clout to make it, and they made it for a price. And Chloe Zhao knew how to do something on the road with authentic people. That was really brave filmmaking, and they were rewarded. Just like Moonlighting was brave and rewarded, and it was a small film that broke so much ground. However, Hollywood will give those opportunities to auteurs, and ultimately, you have to position yourself within a system. And when I say Hollywood, I mean also independent filmmaking. The ultimate thing is, where are you selling your film? When do you get a return on your investment for your story? And that consumes a lot of the energy.
I think, I think Bobette froze. I think part of the film, I think moving into television and streaming has been so interesting. And the pandemic, I mean, I've watched everything on every streaming network, but we've seen some really amazing stories. And it's almost like a new way to tell a story in 6 episodes as opposed to an hour and a half of a film, and where you can really show those complexities in the characters. And just some of the people making some great programming, like Tanya Sriracha, she did Vita, which I think had 3 seasons, telling a Latinx story in Los Angeles. And Michaela Cole, I May Destroy You. That's so powerful. She is amazing. Pamela Adlon, I don't know Adlon, she's the creator of Better Things. She also directs and she acts. So we're seeing women telling these stories, and she's telling stories about her 3 daughters. And I think that is something that has been really fun and wonderful to watch. So there are stories. And Hacks. Have you guys seen Hacks? It's with Jean Smart. Here's a 70-year-old actress who's, just killing it. And again, paired with a younger comedian. And so we're seeing women's stories, young and old, come together and how that works. And the men are in there, but they aren't controlling these women's lives. And that's exciting to see.
Hacks is also written and directed by women,
Yeah.
They won, the Emmy.
That's right. And yeah.
Welcome back, Bobette. I'm sorry that we lost you for a moment, but it's great that you were able to rejoin. But I'm thinking still about taking on board everything, Gretchen and Bobette, that you're saying about some of these really interesting examples. But I'm also thinking about Funmilola's point about the idea of it sort of almost having to kind of slide a foot along the ground to see how far it's okay, like how far we can go in terms of telling some of these stories before it's too far, and before it does mean that actually, Funmilola, you said nobody wants to sort of jeopardize their own career, and nor should they. But it feels, I have that sense that we are still somewhat in that kind of situation of having to just sort of progress very incrementally.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you think about Michaela Cole and her I May Destroy You, and that just was a storm of, excellence. And what she also fought for her own copyright, and that was such a brave personal story. So there is opportunity, but I think it's the mid-range of arriving and trying to get a position, a place at the table, to get into the room. and to get stories taken seriously. That still feels to me like a very closed system. And it becomes more and more closed as opposed to more and more open. And I don't know, what do you all think about that?
I'm hopeful. I think these young women are breaking it down, and I'm hopeful that that can change. And we have so many different avenues for streaming options. Even if, you know, you create a web series and you put it up on YouTube, you get it out there, you build an audience. I mean, so there are ways to push your stories forward. And we need more women making decisions, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I think of the conversations that happen amongst me and some of like my peers and loved ones in terms of what we're consuming, what we're seeing in terms of specifically Black women, right, in terms represented in media. And I think of Michaela Cole and Issa Rae and Shonda Rhimes and how far things have actually gone in terms of being able to tell our own stories and the being able to even be in these spaces, right? How much of a improvement is in so many ways. And this may be coming from my spaces. I will say that maybe it's coming from a particular space of where I exist right now. I there's this nagging in me that's like there's so much more, right, to be explored. And amidst the brilliance, you know, of what we have in the movement forward that has been made, and as proud as I am of it, you know, amidst it, I'm like, there's so much more. And the thing is, that's the case for movement forward in so many industries, right? It's like we press forward step by step as much as possible with each generation that passes. It's been transformational, you know, in the last several years. I remember when the representation was, it was so one-dimensional, right? When I was a kid versus now, and I'm speaking again specifically about the representation of Black women. But I am definitely optimistic as I continue to learn about how these things actually work, which I know that Bobette and Gretchen know more about the kind of behind the scenes, how all of these things work. I'm just now getting more of an understanding of how that operates, especially coming from the world of theater, transitioning into digital storytelling.
Well,
I think for women, I would just say for women, we've been told to be small and not take up space. I'm a very tall woman. And I, you know, grew up thinking I have to be small. And it's really, we need to step into our space and own it and not apologize for it. And that's where the young women making these stories and telling these stories, they don't have that hindrance that I grew up with. And I celebrate that and love that so much in the work that they're doing.
Well, I want to discount the idea that I'm a naysayer and I think it's all going to hell in a handbasket. You know, you keep pushing forward, and if you have a worthy idea that you believe in, keep going. You will find your way. There'll be a crack. So you just have to believe in it. There are so many. It's so much about it is, of course, timing. And all of a sudden, you know, you keep getting closed doors, and all of a sudden, it only takes one yes, and off you go. So I really believe that if you have a story worth telling and you're willing to commit that passion and time, then put it out there because the world needs to hear it. And there's so many people in the industry who don't have the courage of their convictions. They're sort of chasing last year's success. And if they keep making that film that was a success last year, and it comes out in 3 years, and you're in this doldrum of mediocrity. But what the audience wants is audacity. They want to be surprised. They want something fresh. So you need to find those people you align yourself with who want to create audacity. Like, we're going for it. This is going to change the world. Let's do it. And And those are the partners you need to have. And it's a collaborative business. You need to find those partners.
Mm. That's a really important point, I think, this idea of, finding partners, finding people to work with, finding people to collaborate. That's such a rich and important part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for young aspiring filmmakers and content makers is reach out to people. Don't be afraid. I mean, maybe you'll never hear back from someone, but maybe you will. And you just never know. And if you have a good idea and you're passionate about your story, someone's going to listen.
Well, I think that people are looking for the fresh new ideas, the fresh new eye, the talent. But freshness doesn't have to come from youth. Freshness comes from authenticity.
True. And I think we're seeing that as well. And that's to see some, Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, they're working.
I look at the fact Nancy Pelosi, she's in her late 80s. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in her late 80s. So many of our great leaders, as you said in the feminist documentary, we believed that women's lives were over in their 40s. Well, actually over 35. And now we're seeing that there are seasons to productivity and seasons of potential, and you can reinvent yourself. And so I think that's really good news for storytelling.
I agree.
So part of my job is to keep an eye on the time. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I have a question that I'd like to sort of use as, I guess, the last question, because we've covered lots of really fascinating and important areas already. But if we were to come back and have this conversation in a year's time or 2 years' time, I wonder if for each of you there might be something in particular that you can, that you would point to and say, I would like that to have changed. I would like us not to be kind of talking about.
Okay, who wants to go first?
Bobette, you go first.
Well, I'm really tired of the same old story being, why aren't there more opportunities? And here I've been haranguing on about this. I think we're in a really rich moment we're almost in a nadir, so anything should go. And I would like to say in 2 years, it's very exciting because Hollywood's in this total reinvention moment. When I say Hollywood, I mean the whole broadcast streaming industry, where are audiences going? Where are the opportunities? And I would like to say that in 2 years' time, we've seen real risks taken and real opportunities of markets of people who are, really have extraordinary storytelling opportunities and to get their voices out there, because now is the best time.
Thank you. Gretchen.
I agree 100%. I think, to see more opportunities for women. I mean, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, I think, didn't she just write the new James Bond film? I mean, I want to see more women's names up on the screen and see more stories telling a male story. I haven't seen the film yet. I can't wait to see it, to see how did she tell this differently. And hopefully she had the freedom to do what she really wanted to do.
A very strong female producer behind her, Barbara Broccoli. Funmilola, how about for you?
I think that this is a very particular, right? It's a very particular thing that I feel that in this very particular moment, there's an upswing of this very traditional and old conversation around women being too audacious to try to move forward with these very profound, amazing careers in storytelling or careers overall, while also, for instance, women that do, how do I say this? I think that women are still being told that if you move forward with your work, then you should be able to be willing to sacrifice having a full, complete complex life with love and friends and family and all of these things, right? Where it's like it's one or the other, and you do not get to choose to have both, right? And I think that we lived through a time where women were conditioned into believing that they should only veer toward one, which is family and domesticity. And then we've moved away from that space and time where women are able to, again, exist in these spaces in their full humanity, to use their intellect and their creativity to have beautiful careers. But there's this upswing of this conversation once again. And I want to go ahead and say specifically in Black communities around like, well, you know, you need to choose one or the other or shut up, right? And it is a cultural conversation that is happening right now. And if I could, you know, say what I would desire is for that to go the hell away, because it's really it's causing a bit of harm in this particular moment. And I don't know how I can explain the details of it, but it's literally something that has been a conversation culturally in social media in Black communities for about the last year since the pandemic. Because it brought to the surface all of these interesting conversations around vulnerability and love and family and career and work and what's really important. And the fears that were a birth of that are actually rooted in a lot of patriarchal assumptions about the possibilities of women. And if anything, I would hope that we can once again move toward a more nuanced understanding of what we're capable of in our lives. Many things, not just one.
I just want to add one thing to that. There are profound role models out there, and we need to hold on to that, because women have paved the way. They have shown life balance. They have claimed that road. And this is a case of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. People come around and they'll say, well, I don't know, did that really work? It doesn't matter. I think we have to walk forward and say, others have done it, I can now follow. I can see a way, and not listen to the crowd.
Right. And we're seeing it in politics as well here in the United States. We have Cori Bush, we have Ayanna Pressley, we have like some really powerful leaders who are also have families and juggling and, you know, making policy and trying to make change in our country. And that's inspiring.
Thank you all so much. It's been really fascinating and exciting to be part of this event and to hear all of your kind of experiences and perspectives. And I'm thinking about the points that you've all been making as we come to the end. And I feel like here's to nuance and taking space and pushing forward. And I hope we get to, even if it's not the 4 of us together, but maybe it will be, I hope that, in 2 years' time, wherever and however we are having this conversation, that it's by then a slightly different conversation. So thank you both so much. You've been really generous with your thoughts and your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.